Shalom and welcome to the Jewish Ministry, where we teach the Bible from a Jewish historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. We're continuing in our teaching series in the book of Genesis. This is teaching number 21, and we'll be focusing on Genesis chapter 14, verses 13 to 24. I've titled this teaching, Two Kings, Righteousness and Wickedness. Now, before we actually get into the focus of this teaching in the second half of Genesis chapter 14, I want to do a quick review of the first 12 verses or so as they provide the context for this chapter. And we read about these five kings who were living in the Jordan Valley area and how they and their kingdoms served the four kings in the east. Now, we're actually only given two of the locations, or we only know two of the locations of the kings from the east, and that's why I call them the kings of the east, because one's in Shinar, which is in the southern Mesopotamia area, where Babylon was located, as well as the kingdom next to that was Elam, which is just to the east of the kingdom of Shinar. So these five kings in the Jordan Valley served the four kings for a period of about 12 years, probably paying tribute in some way and recognizing them as the dominant kingdoms. However, in the 13th year, they rebelled against the four kings and no longer paid the tribute. And then in the 14th year, we read how the four kings came over and they made war against the five kings in the Jordan Valley. Now, although this is true, we read how the four kings first came and attacked these other peoples that were living on the eastern side of the Jordan Valley. We read about the four kings, how they attacked the Rephaim, the Zuzim, the Emim, and the Horites, who were all living on that eastern side of the Jordan Valley. So if the four kings from the east came to make war with the five kings in the Jordan Valley, why did the four kings attack these other peoples first? Now, we looked at this in the previous teaching, and I think we see a clear answer in Deuteronomy chapter 2, because in that explanation of Moses regarding the journeys of the children of Israel, he describes for us how these peoples, the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Zuzim, the Emim, are all connected to the Nephilim, right? The fallen peoples, the giants in the land, as they're referred to both in Genesis 6 and Numbers 14. And we read in Deuteronomy 2 how it was the Lord who destroyed these different peoples that the four kings attacked, right? So we can understand from putting these scriptures together that the Lord used the four kings from the east to bring judgment and wipe out the evil peoples connected to the Nephilim, who were living on the eastern side of the Jordan Valley, right? The Rephaim, the Anakim, the Zuzim, the Emim, and the Horites, as we see them laid out on the screen. They're kind of color-coded with the names there as we see them. And as we put these scriptures together, right, Genesis 6 and Genesis 14, Numbers 13, Deuteronomy 2, we can kind of understand how it was the Lord who used these four kings from the east to come down and to wipe out these evil peoples that were connected to the Nephilim. Now, after the four kings from the east destroyed and annihilated the peoples on the eastern side of the Jordan, they went down into the desert region. Then they turned around and came up to Ein Mishpat, right, which means the spring of judgment. It's also called Kadesh, meaning sanctification. And there they struck the fields of the Amalekites and the Amorites. And then the four kings came back up to the Jordan Valley, and that's when they came to the Valley of the Fields, as we see it on our screen, right? We don't know exactly where they were located, but somewhere in this Jordan Valley. And we read how the five kings of the Jordan Valley prepared for war against the four kings from the east. And we talked about this last time, how they were expecting the four kings from the east to somehow pay them back for rebelling, right? For rebelling against them. And we read the outcome of the war in the first few verses of Genesis 14, how the kings of the Jordan Valley and the men, right, their warriors, fled from the kings of the east. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah are spoken of as falling into tar pits, and how all the rest of their men, right, all of their warriors fled to the mountains. So the four kings of the east conquered the kingdoms of the Jordan Valley and took the people and their possessions, including Lot. Now, it doesn't say that they destroyed them. It says they simply took them captive. So different from how they handled the other peoples on the eastern side of the Jordan Valley, right? But the four kings took all of the people and possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah, along with Lot and his possessions. Now, why did God allow the people of the Jordan Valley to be conquered and taken captive by the four kings of the east? We're not actually given a direct answer to this in the scriptures. However, I personally believe that the Lord used the four kings from the east to discipline the five kings of the Jordan Valley, including Lot. He disciplined them while showing them mercy, right? They were taken captive. They weren't destroyed at that time. Now, we know for sure that the Lord used the four kings to destroy the peoples on the eastern side of the Jordan Valley, as recorded in Deuteronomy 2:21. So I'm assuming that it was the Lord who used these four kings to bring discipline to them, and kind of a warning sign. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Now, in the previous teaching, we concluded this section with the first part of verse 13, which explains how Avram heard about the outcome of the battle in the Jordan Valley. As we read, one who escaped came and told Avram the Hebrew. And we focused on that phrase, Avram the Hebrew, right? Or in the Hebrew language, Avram ha-Ivri, and how that phrase really is meaningful, right? Because it speaks of not only of the lineage of Avram as coming as a descendant of Shem, who and one of the descendants is named Ever, right? So as a descendant of Ever, he's an Ivri. But even more importantly, how Avram obeyed the word of the Lord, crossed over the Euphrates River, but also left behind the gods of his ancestors, right, and followed the Lord, one who has crossed over. So there's that spiritual implication, as we read about in Joshua 24. Anyone who crosses over, just like the Israelites crossed over the Jordan River, right, leaving behind the gods of Egypt. So there's the understanding of the Hebrew. A Hebrew is being not just one who's descended from this certain people group, but also spiritually one who follows after the Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as we say today. Now, as we continue in Genesis 14, we see how Avram was confronted with serious life choices, including the choice between righteousness and wickedness. In what manner was Avram confronted with the choice between righteousness and wickedness, as we read it in Genesis chapter 14? So hopefully we'll see a clear answer to this question as we work our way through the scriptures. So let's continue in Genesis chapter 14, verses 13 to 16, where we read this. One who escaped came and told Avram the Hebrew. Now he was living in the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, the brother of Eshcol and the brother of Aner, for they were covenanted with Avram. When Avram heard that his brother had been taken captive, he took all the trained men who were born in his house, 318 men, and pursued them as far as Dan. He divided his men against them at night, and he and his servants struck them. They pursued them as far as Hobah, which is to the left of Damascus. And he brought back all the possessions, and Lot, his brother, and his possessions were restored, and also the women and the people. So that's verses 13 to 16. And just to give a summary of what we read here, Avram took his 318 trained men, right, that were born in his house, together with the other men, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, in order to rescue his nephew Lot. And just to point out here, as we understand that Avram had 318 trained men, right, able to go to war, basically between the ages of 20 and 50, it shows how big of a kind of a village he went around with, right? It wasn't just him and a few sheep, right? He was known as a very wealthy man, and he had a big entourage of people, including 318 men who were ready to go to war. Now, where was Avram living when the refugee came to him to give the report about Lot? We read in verse 13, now he was living in the oaks of Mamre, and the natural question is, where were the oaks of Mamre? And we know from the previous chapter that Avram moved his tent to Hebron. In Genesis 13:18, we read, then Avram moved his tent and went and dwelt in the oaks of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Now, as you see it on your screen here, we have Shechem, Beit El or Bethel, Jerusalem, and then Hebron in the south, right? And these are actually some of the main places where um, Avram lived or even visited, as we read about in today's text. Now, the oaks of Mamre were in Hebron in the southern part, as you see it on the screen there. And now this place of Hebron is also called Kiryat Arba, just like many places in the ancient world, especially in the biblical land. There's more than one name. And this is a mountainous area. Again, it's located south of Jerusalem there, and also south of Beit El. Now, this name Mamre was actually the name of one of the brothers whom Avram had an agreement with, as we read in Genesis in verse 13, right? Genesis 14:13. Avram had a covenant with these three brothers, Mamre, Eshkel, and Aner. So Mamre, the oaks of Mamre were simply the forest area of this guy Mamre, right? Which was one of the guys who Avram was in agreement with, had a covenant with. So therefore, these three men went with Avram, these three brothers, right? Together with Avram's 318 men to rescue Lot, all of his possessions, the people, Sodom and Gomorrah, and all of their possessions. Now, Avram and his coalition struck the invaders of the land, the four kings from the east, and they brought back the people and their possessions. Now, it's interesting to note that what the five kings of the Jordan Valley, including the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, with their armies, were unable to do against the four kings of the east, Avram did with his 318 men, together with his coalition, right, the three brothers, by the blessing and power of the Lord, right? So it's just a good reminder of how when someone has the blessing and power of the Lord, they can do so much more than seems possible in the natural. A natural question that we can also ask is how long did this rescue operation take, right? That Avram led with his 318 men and the others. Now, it's not actually written for us in the scriptures, but we read that Avram and his men pursued the four kings of the east as far as Hobah, which is to the left of Damascus. And as we think about geographically where these places are located, as we see Hebron on the screen, kind of more in the south there, the south of Jerusalem, and then we have Hobah next to Damascus there. Now, just flying directly from point A to point B, it's about 150 miles or 250 kilometers, and they naturally wouldn't fly there, right? They're taking their either horses or camels, whatever they were riding. So they would have went in a different route, and it would have been a little bit longer than what I have mentioned here. Now, they could have maybe made it there in several days or let's say a week, but then on the return, they have all these people, they have all their goods, their possessions, their cattle, whatever it is, and so they're going back at a walking pace. So this was an event that took place over several weeks. Now, just to mention as well, as I was doing my research and preparing for this teaching in February of 2025, there are a lot of images on the web regarding this area that we're referring to right now, because there's ongoing war with the Hezbollah in Lebanon, even up until recently with Syria. And so I had these different images, and it's just interesting to see how basically the same area is being fought over, and there's still battles going on 4,000 years later. Now we read in verse 14 that Avram and his men journeyed north to Dan, and it was there that he divided up his forces, and then he attacked the four kings of the east in Hobah, right? Now we assume that this is speaking of the future tribe of Dan, right, who is also known by his location in the north of Israel. Now, why is Dan mentioned in the time of Avram, the tribe of Israel, which isn't even existing yet, right? Dan was a son of Jacob and the father of the future tribe of Israel, but neither he nor his tribe existed at this time, as we're reading about it in Genesis 14. We don't read about the tribe of Dan being in northern Israel until Joshua 19, much later. So this is about 500 years later. So this again shows how scribes of the Bible sometimes use names of places that the reader is familiar with and not the names of the locations at that time. So again, we see this over and over again, especially in Genesis when a lot of those places are no longer associated with that name. Now after Avram and his coalition forces brought back all of the people and their possessions to the central region of the land of Canaan, we read the conclusion to this victorious battle in the final verses of this chapter. So let's keep reading the last section of Genesis chapter 14, which is verses 17 to 24. Then the king of Sodom came out to greet him after he returned from striking Kedor Laomer and the kings who were with him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the valley of the king. Now Melchizedek, king of Shalem, brought out bread and wine, for he was priest of God Most High. Then he blessed him and said, Blessed be Avram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tenth of everything. Then the king of Sodom said to Avram, Give me the people, and take for yourself the possessions. But Avram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. I will not take anything that belongs to you, even a string or a strap of a sandal, so that you will not say, I made Avram rich. Except for what the young men have eaten and the portion of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshkol, and Mamre, they will take their portion. So that brings us to the end of Genesis chapter 14. And the final 8 verses here are so well written and so well crafted as they tie together this biblical account of war and judgment, mercy, deliverance, and blessing. Bera, king of Sodom, is the first one to come out to greet Avram after he had returned from this battle, right? At a place called the Valley of Shaveh. And this phrase in Hebrew is Emech Shaveh, and it literally means the level valley or the valley of equality. This valley was also called Emek Hamelech, meaning valley of the king. And this valley is named one other time in the scriptures in 2 Samuel 18:18. That's how we can more properly identify it as a valley outside of Jerusalem, or as it's called at that time, Shalem. So this is an artist's depiction of ancient Jerusalem, according to some of the archaeological finds in the land. So it was one of those valleys outside of the city where they met, where Avram came and these two different kings met with him. The evil king of Sodom, Bera, went out to meet the man whom the Lord had blessed, Avram, and then the righteous king of Shalem, Melchizedek, came out to bless Avram. And it truly was this valley of Shaveh, right? This level valley in every way, right? Not simply in a geographical manner, right? But and having this wicked king and the righteous king standing on the same ground with the man whom God had chosen to bless, Avram. The second name of that location where they met, the Valley of the King, seems to also be used in a prophetic manner. It was not called the Valley of the Kings, but the Valley of the King, because there is only one true king of the kingdom. Bera, king of Sodom, was an evil and wicked king. Now, although the king of Sodom came out first to greet Avram, it was Melchizedek, the king of Shalem, who would have preeminence. As we read in verse 18, now Melchizedek, king of Shalem, brought out bread and wine, for he was priest of God Most High. Now the name Melchizedek, or actually it's pronounced Malki-Tzedek, means king of righteousness or my righteous king. And just to point out the proper way to say it, Malki-Tzedek, it's pronounced that way, but the word is Melech, so therefore I think we generally call him Melchizedek, and that's the way we write it in English as well. It just kind of makes more sense, but the original is Melchizedek, but again, that name means king of righteousness. Now, Melchizedek is identified with his kingdom, king of Shalem, or in the Hebrew, Melech Shalem, meaning king of peace. Now, the Hebrew word Shalem is rich in meaning, like most Hebrew words that can have 4, 5, 6 meanings depending on their usage. And we know that the word shalem can mean peace, perfection, completion, or soundness. And they're all kind of related, right? These meanings. Now, the city of Shalem is understood to be the ancient city of Yerushalayim, or Jerusalem, as we say it in English. Now, as I was doing this study, it was actually fascinating to see that the word Jerusalem, or as is written in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament, it is found 644 times. There are others who say 660 times. I did not take the time to count them, but they're, we'll say, approximately 650 times. But out of those almost 650 times, it's only written 4 times as Yerushalayim with the extra yud in it, right? Yerushalayim is spelled with a yud as the first letter, but also has a yud as the second to last letter. But it's only found 4 times written in this manner in the Hebrew scriptures. And 639 times it's written as Yerushalem, or Yerushalam, or Yerushalem, right? Without the yud, without the second yud in it. So the majority of times it's written without the second yud, I think, which also just emphasizes that original name of Shalem, right? Simply the Shin, Lam, and Mem. Now, Genesis 14:18 is the only place that Jerusalem, Shalem, is found in the Torah. So Jerusalem as Shalem is only found 1 time in the first 5 books, right? Genesis through Deuteronomy. And then it's only found 1 other time as Shalem in Psalm 76:2. So the word Shalem as the city of Jerusalem was only found in those 2 places, Genesis 14:18 and Psalm 76:2. Now, getting back to the name Jerusalem or Yerushalayim, what does this name mean? Now, there's no one clear definition for Jerusalem. I want to provide my definition of the meaning of the name, which I believe it means to strive or contend for peace. And I based that on what we read in Judges chapter 6, where Gideon was given a new name, Yerubbaal. And that first part of his name is identical to what we see in Jerusalem, right? Yeru, that Yeru sound has meaning. And he was given the name Yerubbaal because he tore down the altar of Baal, right? And the people wanted to kill him, but his father protected him. And he said, let Baal contend for himself. And that word contend or strive is Yariv, and it's shortened here with Yaru, right? And it was, as we read in Judges 6:32, therefore on that day he named him Yerubbaal. That is to say, let Baal contend against him, right? So let Baal contend for himself, or strive for himself, fight for himself. And so in that understanding, I believe the word Yerushalayim has this idea that there's a continual battle for Jerusalem, and those who live in Jerusalem must continue to contend or strive for its shalem, right, for its peace. So that is my understanding of Yerushalayim, the meaning of the name, to contend or strive for peace. So what about Melchizedek? Who was Melchizedek? Melchizedek is well known by anyone who has read the Bible, Jew or Christian. He's famous, right, because of this interaction in Genesis 14 with Avram. However, Melchizedek is a mysterious person because we barely know anything about him. Now, we read about Melchizedek 1 other time in the Hebrew scriptures, right, in the Old Testament, in Psalm 110. I just want to read this psalm. It's a famous psalm. It's a short psalm, and it's also a messianic psalm. We read this, a psalm of David. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. The Lord will stretch forth your strong scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will volunteer freely in the day of your power. In holy array from the womb of the dawn, your youth are to you as the dew. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings in the day of his wrath. He will judge among the nations. He will fill them with corpses. He will shatter the chief men over a broad country. He will drink from the brook by the wayside. Therefore, he will lift up his head. It's a powerful psalm, right? This messianic psalm, Psalm 110. Now, Yeshua himself actually quoted this psalm to prove from the scriptures that the Messiah, speaking of himself, would be both the king of Israel as the son of David, and also a unique one as King David called him Lord. And so we see that in Psalm 110:1, where Yeshua talks about it in Matthew 22. You can look at that in Matthew 22:41 to 46. Now, this unique one, right, who's spoken of in Psalm 110, would be an eternal priest in the order of Melchizedek. Now, in the New Testament, we read a few references of Melchizedek as they pertain to Yeshua as the Messiah in his office of the high priest. Now, most notably, we read about the high priestly office of Yeshua in the book of Hebrews. And this is kind of the central theme of Hebrews. And we read about Melchizedek here in Hebrews 7:1 to 3. And I'll read it. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham apportioned a tenth part of all the spoils, was first of all, by the translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, which is King of Peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, who remains a priest perpetually. So that's Hebrews 7:1 to 3. Now, in the context of the letter to the Hebrews, Melchizedek is compared to Yeshua, the Son of God who lives forever. The perpetual priesthood is uniquely attributed to Melchizedek since his origins and death are not recorded in the Bible. Right? So that's the uniqueness of this man, Melchizedek. Just to mention, there are some who believe that he was a pre-incarnate Messiah, right? A appearing of the Messiah before he came into the world. And others believe he was simply a normal man who was high priest of God. That's debatable, and I'll leave it to others to debate. Now, Yeshua's high priestly status is confirmed according to the priesthood of Melchizedek, right? As we read in Hebrews 6:19 to 20, which is actually just the verses preceding Hebrews 7:1 to 3. We read this: This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil, where Yeshua has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So that's Hebrews 6:19 to 20. And just a reminder, right? Our Messiah is a high priest forever, right? According to this order of Melchizedek. Now, although we do not know the origins of Melchizedek, we know the origins of Messiah. Messiah came to earth from the Father in heaven by means of the miraculous conception and the virgin birth by his mother Mary. We know the Messiah's mother and father in a sense, right? Even though it's mysterious. Now, the Messiah is eternal and he lived forever because of his unique origins and the way he came into this world. The life of Melchizedek is actually more mysterious than the life of our Messiah, right? We don't know anything about the origins, the mother and father of Melchizedek, or about his death. Now, although we know very little about Melchizedek, his life as king of Shalem, Jerusalem, and king of righteousness was used to foreshadow the life of our Messiah. The name Melchizedek also helps us to see a connection between one of the names of the Messiah and the city of Jerusalem, right? So again, that name meaning king of righteousness. And he's also King of Shalem, right? King of peace. Now, in Jeremiah, we read a unique name and title of the Messiah. In Jeremiah chapter 23, verses 5 and 6, where we read, Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and act wisely and do justice and righteousness in the land. In his days, Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely. And this is his name by which he will be called, the Lord our righteousness. And then Hebrew, that's Adonai Tzidkenu. That's Jeremiah 23, 5 to 6. So one of the names of our Messiah when he comes to reign as king on earth will be Adonai Tzidkenu, the Lord our righteousness. He will do justice and righteousness in the land, as we read in Jeremiah 23. And he will be called Adonai Tzidkenu, the Lord our righteousness. Now, we actually see the same exact name given for the city of Jerusalem a few chapters later, and it's easy to remember. The name of the Messiah as Adonai Tzidkenu is in Jeremiah 23, and the name of Jerusalem is in Jeremiah 33. So 10 chapters later in verses 15 to 16, where we read, In those days and at that time I will cause a righteous branch of David to spring forth, and he shall execute justice and righteousness on the earth. In those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will dwell in safety. And this is the name by which she will be called. The Lord is our righteousness. Now, the English translation here adds the verb is, but in the Hebrew, it's simply Adonai Tzidkenu, the Lord our righteousness, just like in Jeremiah 23. So when Messiah comes and reigns on earth, the righteousness of the Lord will prevail on the earth from Jerusalem. Adonai Tzidkenu, the Lord our righteousness. It would be both the name of a Messiah and the name of the city where he dwells. Yerushalayim, Jerusalem. The reign of Melchizedek as king of Shalem was a perfect picture of the coming Messiah who would reign as a righteous king and a high priest forever. Now in verse 18, we read how Melchizedek, king of Shalem, brought out bread and wine, for he was priest of God Most High. So why did Melchizedek bring out bread and wine? So in one commentary I read, bread and wine were customary provisions that were given to soldiers after they returned from battle. So in that manner, Melchizedek honored Avram as a triumphant commander of the armies that brought back the people. Now, in Genesis 14:18, it's the first time we see bread and wine used together with a blessing in the Bible. And this is actually very significant. The Jewish tradition of starting each Sabbath, as well as each holiday, begins with a blessing together with bread and wine. And it seems to have its foundation here in Genesis chapter 14. Now, the Hebrew word for sanctification is kiddush. And the verb form is lekadesh, to make holy or to sanctify. And this kiddush that we perform weekly for Shabbat is done with a blessing together with bread and wine, right? So a certain blessing is recited together with bread and wine, and in that way we set apart, sanctify the Sabbath on a weekly basis. Now, beyond simple provisions, we also see how the bread and wine given to Avram by Melchizedek were a spiritual act. Since Melchizedek was priest of God Most High, and Avram was the man whom the Lord blessed and set apart on this earth, we can see how the giving of bread and wine to Avram was a priestly act of sanctification, setting someone or something apart as holy to the Lord. Now, the blessing of Melchizedek over Avram seems to support this understanding. So read the blessing again in verses 19 to 20. Then he, meaning Melchizedek, blessed him and said, "Blessed be Avram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." Melchizedek's blessing over Avram's life was simple, but it was also quite profound. I just want to summarize his blessing in these 4 points. Number 1, Melchizedek blessed Avram of God Most High. Number 2, he acknowledged that God Most High is the possessor of heaven and earth. Number 3, he blessed God Most High. And number 4, he acknowledged that it was God Most High who delivered Avram's enemies into his hands. In this blessing, Melchizedek elevated God to his proper place as El Elyon, God Most High, the one who possesses heavens and earth, the one who blessed Avram, and the one who gave Avram success over his enemies. Now, I just want to point out that this title of God, El Elyon, it's the first time we actually see it in the scriptures as well, here in Genesis 14. Avram responded to this blessing by giving Melchizedek a tithe of all the spoils from the battle. Avram acknowledged Melchizedek as the priest of God Most High and gave him a tenth of all. Now, why did Avram give a tithe to Melchizedek? There is actually no specific reason given in the text. However, Avram's decision to give a tenth or a tithe of all the spoils from what he brought back from the north, right, to Melchizedek appears to confirm his acceptance of Melchizedek as priest of God Most High. And I believe what we read in Hebrews chapter 7, verses 1 to 10 confirm this as well. Now, this is the first time we see the Hebrew word ma'aser, meaning a tenth or a tithe in the scriptures. There are many firsts we're seeing as we go through this Genesis series, as Genesis is the first book in the Bible. And the foundational aspects of sanctification, giving a blessing together with bread and wine, and the giving of a tithe are all seen in this interaction between Avram and Melchizedek, and even that acknowledging of God as El Elyon, God Most High. It's the first time we're seeing it, right? And these biblical foundations are so important because they continue till today in the traditions and practices in both Judaism and Christianity. These practices of sanctification, blessing with bread and wine, and giving of the tithe right back to the Lord. These are things that we still practice until today. So it's beautiful to see their foundations in the scriptures. Now Melchizedek brought out bread and wine and gave it to Avram. What did Bera, king of Sodom, bring to Avram? We do not read anything specific in the text concerning what the king of Sodom brought to Avram to greet him. However, we do read of Bera's gesture of gratitude. I just want to read verses 21 and 24 again to put it in context. So these are our last 4 verses in Genesis 14. Then the king of Sodom said to Avram, "Give me the people and take for yourself the possessions." But Avram said to the king of Sodom, "I have lifted my hand to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. I will not take anything that belongs to you, even a string or a strap of a sandal, so that you will not say, 'I made Avram rich,' except for what the young men have eaten and the portion of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. They will take their portion." So again, it's the last 4 verses of Genesis 14. Now Bera, the king of Sodom, offered Avram to take the possessions of the people for himself as his reward. Now, was Bera being generous to Avram? It's possible. Maybe he was being generous as the king of his kingdom, or maybe he was just being generous with the possessions of his people. Sometimes kings and politicians tend to give away what's not theirs more easily. Now, Avram's response to Bera was noble and righteous. Avram began his response to Bera, king of Sodom, by declaring his loyalty to the Lord God Most High, who possesses heaven and earth. Avram was a friend of God, and he had everything he needed and more. Avram did not need what Bera offered him, and he blatantly rejected the offer of Bera to take the possessions of the people. Avram declared that he would not take anything from Bera, whose name means evil. Avram knew that Bera was wicked, and he did not want to be associated with this wicked king. Avram did, however, make sure his young men got their share, and that the brothers who were covenanted to him got their portion. The events recorded in Genesis 14 present a clear contrast between wickedness and righteousness. I just want to end this teaching with a short summary of what we see in this chapter. The Lord used Kedur Laomer and the kings from the east to destroy certain evil peoples who lived on the eastern side of the Jordan Valley, the Rephaim, the Zuzim, the Emim, and the Chlorites. We know that Sodom and Amorah were wicked cities, as is noted when Lot first moved his tent close to Sodom back in Genesis 13, and that their final result for their great wickedness against the Lord was total annihilation, as we read later in Genesis chapter 19. Now, it is my opinion that the Lord used the 4 kings from the east to discipline the peoples of the 5 kingdoms of the Jordan Valley, right, including Sodom and Amorah. The people of Sodom and Amorah were taken captive, right, but they were kept alive, and the Lord used Avram to deliver them from the kings of the east. The Lord showed them mercy and gave them an opportunity to cry out to him. Now, unfortunately, from what we read in the Bible, they did not repent or cry out to the Lord. Therefore, they were later destroyed, as we read in Genesis chapter 19. In the valley of Shaveh, the valley of the king, 2 kings came out to greet Avram on his return: Bera, king of Sodom, and Melchizedek, king of Shalem. Now, Avram received the blessing of Melchizedek, the righteous king, but he rejected the offer from Bera, the wicked king. Avram chose righteousness over wickedness. Just like Avram, every one of us faces situations in life that cause us to make choices. We must continually choose good and pursue righteousness while rejecting the evil things that lead to wickedness. In the New Testament, we read how the Apostle Paul gave Timothy wise spiritual advice in this regard. In 1 Timothy 6, verses 9 to 11, we read, "But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. But flee from these things, you man of God, and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness." That is 1 Timothy 6, 9 to 11. And Paul's advice to Timothy was, don't be tempted by the deceitfulness of riches. Flee from these things and pursue righteousness. Life is a series of choices: to trust or not to trust, to judge or to bless, to engage in war or to seek peace, to choose righteousness or to choose wickedness, just as we see in this chapter. Now, we are all called to be the people of God, and we must choose to pursue righteousness. Avram gave us a great example in this chapter of how he lived his life. And when he was confronted by these two kings, right, he chose to receive the blessing of Melchizedek, the righteous king, and he refused the offer of Bera, the king of Sodom, the wicked king. So it's a beautiful conclusion to this chapter, Genesis 14, 13 to 24. Here are some of the resources I used in my preparation for this teaching. As always, feel free to share this teaching with others. I also want to invite you to partner with Nether Glide. We are a nonprofit organization, and we're totally dependent on generous donations from viewers like yourself, and you can do so on our website, netherglide.com. I also want to invite you to subscribe to our weekly emails if you're not already receiving them. And again, you can do so on our website or simply scan the QR code on your screen. And once you get to the website, you can either click the Give or Subscribe tabs as needed. Thank you so much. God bless you, and see you again next time.